You know that moment when you're in a group conversation and you finally find a small opening to speak, but instead of jumping in, you hesitate for half a second and then decide it's not worth it. Someone else starts talking and you let it happen. You tell yourself it's fine. Or when someone forgets to reply to your message and instead of following up, you quietly tell yourself they're busy and move on. Or when you feel hurt by something small, but you swallow it so quickly that even you pretend it didn't matter. From the outside, this looks like confidence, like you're low maintenance, easygoing, unbothered. But sometimes it's not confidence at all. Sometimes it's the psychology of a child who learned that being quiet was safer than being noticed. For a long time, you might have believed this was just your personality. Maybe you're just naturally reserved. Maybe you don't like attention. Maybe you're simply independent. But when you slow down and look at what happens in childhood, when a child feels unseen, a different story begins to form. Not a dramatic story, not one filled with obvious trauma, just small, repeated moments where your feelings didn't quite land anywhere. And here's what makes this interesting. Children don't need perfect parents. They don't need applause every time they speak, but they do need to feel noticed in a steady, warm way. When that doesn't happen consistently, the brain quietly adapts. This is the part most people miss. Being ignored doesn't always look like neglect in the way people imagine. It can look like parents who were busy, tired, distracted, dealing with their own stress. It can look like a house where your physical needs were met, but your emotional world was rarely explored. You weren't yelled at, you weren't harmed, you just weren't fully seen. And when that happens, a child doesn't think, my caregivers are overwhelmed. A child thinks, maybe I'm too much, or maybe what I feel isn't important. The brain of a child is always asking one quiet question: what do I need to do to stay connected? If being loud doesn't bring attention, the brain tries being quiet. If sharing feelings doesn't lead to comfort, the brain tries hiding them. If excitement is brushed aside, the brain turns the volume down. This isn't weakness, it's intelligence. The brain is built to protect you from repeated disappointment, so it runs experiments. And when something reduces pain, even a little, it keeps that strategy. Fast forward into adulthood, and those strategies don't just disappear. You become the person who doesn't ask for much, the one who says, I'm fine before anyone even asks, the one who handles things alone because relying on others feels uncertain. On the surface, this looks strong, and in many ways it is, but underneath that strength can be a quiet expectation that your needs won't be met anyway, so why risk asking? There's a reason this feels confusing. Part of you feels proud of being independent. You don't cause problems, you don't demand attention, you don't make scenes. But another part of you feels strangely invisible. You can be surrounded by people and still feel like no one truly sees you. And when someone does give you their full attention, something unexpected can happen. You might feel uncomfortable, exposed, unsure what to say. Your mind might go blank when someone says, tell me more about that. Not because you have nothing inside, but because you're not used to your inner world being the focus. Here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Research on emotional neglect shows that the absence of response can shape a child just as deeply as harsh treatment. It's not about one big moment. It's about repetition. Small signals over and over, a story half listened to, a feeling redirected instead of explored, a tear that wasn't fully noticed. Each moment on its own looks harmless, but together they quietly answer the question, do I matter right now? When that answer feels uncertain, a child adapts by becoming easier, less loud, less needy, more self-sufficient. And that adaptation can follow you for decades. You might find yourself shrinking in conversations without realizing it. You might downplay your achievements. You might minimize your hurt before anyone else has the chance to. It becomes automatic, almost invisible. This is where it gets deeper. Ignored children often grow into adults who are extremely aware of others. You notice tone changes. You sense when someone's mood shifts. You can feel distance before a word is spoken. That sensitivity didn't appear out of nowhere. It developed because you were scanning for attention. You were learning to read subtle cues, to understand when it was safe to speak, safe to ask, safe to need. From the outside, this can look like emotional intelligence, and sometimes it truly is. But sometimes it's a nervous system that learned to work hard for small signs of connection. You became skilled at adjusting yourself, at making sure you fit, at not taking up too much space. And because you're so good at it, people may not realize how much effort it takes. There's another quiet pattern that often shows up. Many ignored children grow into adults who give more than they receive. You check in on others. You remember details. You make sure people feel included. You become what you once needed. And there's something beautiful about that. But there's also a subtle ache underneath it. A question you may not say out loud. Would anyone notice if I stopped? That question doesn't come from ego. It comes from history, from moments where your presence didn't seem to shift anything. So you learned not to expect much reaction at all. And when someone forgets you or overlooks you, you don't confront it. You explain it away. You protect them from your disappointment before they even know it exists. There's a reason this pattern is so persistent. The brain remembers emotional pain. It remembers the feeling of reaching out and not being met. So later in life, it avoids creating that same situation. Instead of asking directly for reassurance, it stays silent. Instead of expressing hurt, it minimizes it. Instead of expecting to be chosen, it prepares not to be. And yet, here's the quiet truth. None of this means you are broken. It means your brain did exactly what it was designed to do. It protected you. It reduced pain where it could. It created independence when connection felt uncertain. That independence may have helped you succeed. It may have made you responsible, capable, and strong. But strength built on self-erasure can feel lonely. This is where awareness becomes powerful, not in a dramatic way, but in a gentle one. When you notice yourself shrinking in a room, you might begin to see the younger version of you who once learned that shrinking was safer. When you catch yourself saying, "It's fine," too quickly, you might sense the old habit of protecting yourself from being overlooked again. Understanding this doesn't mean blaming anyone. Many caregivers were doing their best with limited tools. Emotional absence is often unintentional. It happens quietly, which is why its effects are so hard to name. You might look back at your childhood and think, nothing terrible happened, and that may be true. Sometimes it's not about what happened, it's about what didn't. If this feels familiar, there's nothing dramatic you need to do about it right now. Just noticing the pattern can feel grounding. Just realizing that your discomfort with attention, your tendency to minimize yourself, your quiet independence all have roots. They didn't appear randomly. They were shaped gently over time. If this conversation feels like it's putting language to something you've always sensed but never fully understood, you can subscribe and stay connected. These reflections are here for people who want to understand themselves a little more clearly. And if you'd like to support the channel more deeply, you can join as a member. I genuinely appreciate it. At the end of the day, the psychology of the ignored child is not a story about weakness. It's a story about adaptation, about a child who adjusted to their environment in the smartest way they knew how. A child who found safety in being quiet, who found control in not needing much, who survived by becoming self-sufficient. And maybe, tonight, instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" you might find yourself thinking, "Of course I am. Of course you learned to shrink. Of course you learned to handle things alone. Of course attention feels unfamiliar. There is nothing defective about you. There is history. There is logic. There is a younger version of you who was doing their best with what they had. And seeing that clearly, without judgment, can feel like a quiet kind of relief.